Welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey everybody, April and I are back. Do a little podcast.
Hello.
How you doing today, April?
I am fantastic. The sky is blue. There are white clouds just floating around, and we have a grandbaby.
Yes, we do. Glorious
So
time.
that is good.
That's right.
Yes.
Speaking of the sky being blue, though, we got to talk about Bluey. So I wanted to sort of run this thing by you. So this article that I'm working on, this concept, this article is called "The New Ideal Father is the Traditional Mother." So we're going to look at that. And the subtitle of the article is "Exploring the Symbolic Father from the Hit TV Show Bluey." So this is the first of two articles that I wrote. I wrote this one, and then that created some conversation. And I wrote a second article, kind of clarifying, going another layer deeper. But we will start with this one and see where this takes us. I'd love to get your take on that. So as the Western world catches collective amnesia around the profile of the historic father, we've begun to move past portrayals of fathers as the bumbling idiot of shows in the 80s and 90s to a new kind of engaged, empathetic, and present father. There's only one problem with this new ideal father. He embodies almost all of the elements of the traditional mother, purged of the essence of elements from the historic father. The poster child for this new depiction can be found in the mega popular kids program Bluey. The dad, Bandit, is seen as a constantly nurturing, always present playmate to his two daughters, Bluey and Bingo. He's so present, in fact, that fans of the show often joke about what Bandit finds time to work, when Bandit finds time to work. And in the show, it's clear that the mother has less time to play than the dad. Our culture loves this depiction of fatherhood. It empties the father character of all the elements of the traditionally masculine father we've grown uncomfortable with. And at the same time, it provides freedom for the mother to get out in the world and explore her individual passions. Everyone wins, right? Well, it depends. It depends on whether there is an objective ideal of fatherhood and motherhood. And if there is, then symbolic depictions seeking to reverse these objective profiles becomes problematic. Embracing these kinds of portrayals, especially in a highly symbolic medium, like in a cartoon, will go a long way in shaping our intuitions around the essence of these roles. Now, today, almost no one thinks there is an objective ideal to these archetypes. And if they are right, then they personally resonate with the father, mother, and daughter depictions in Bluey, and everything I'm about to say will be dissonant and probably offensive, although we need to stop being offended by diverse opinions. So let me say from the outset that in the conservative Christian world, my position is a tiny minority, maybe less than 1%. So feel free to stop listening if you're getting triggered. But if you're open to exploring my strange take, here we go. Let me lay out three premises I believe about this topic. And if you disagree with any of these, you'll likely disagree with my conclusions. Number one, masculinity and femininity are not social constructs or primarily biological concepts, but are family concepts designed to create a certain dynamic intended to construct a highly functional, multi-generational family team. Two, the Bible presents meta descriptions of masculine/fatherhood and femininity/motherhood through symbolic characters primarily rooted in the story of Genesis. And three, meta depictions of these roles are good and necessary to give culture at large something concrete to aim at, even though all of us as individuals will find some elements of these roles dissonant with our desires or even our innate wiring. So I derived my first premise from the theological principle of first mention. When God created male and female, he actually revealed a purpose for gender, and that was to create a certain kind of family team. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing that moves on the face of the earth." God creates the concepts of male and female to create the kind of family that would maximize fruitfulness and multiplication over generations of collective effort that would subdue, expand the garden over creation, and rule the created order. Genesis 1 does not yet give us content around the different male and female roles, only that male and female combine to achieve the purpose of the family. The second premise is that Genesis gives meta depictions of the various parts of the family, and these meta roles can be seen in the Hebrew names given to the characters. Adam is the word for man or humanity. So if you're reading Genesis in Hebrew and you're saying Adam, 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 you're constantly saying man, 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 or humanity, depending on how you want to translate that. But these are definitely meta depictions. And Eve is the Hebrew concept for the giver of life. But since we are focused here on fatherhood, the most important character comes when we meet a man named Avram or Abram. Abram in Hebrew means exalted father. Abram is literally described in our language as a meta-father. As he progresses in this role, his name is even elongated to Abraham, the father of many nations. So exalted father, meta means sort of exalted or above or transcendent. So it's like a depiction. So exalted father, meta father, that's the literal kind of meaning of the word Avram or Abram. One struggle that Greek-minded people often have is to think that meta or exalted means ideal or model. Abram is not the perfect father. He's the meta father. We understand the elements of how God interacts with both a specific father, Abram, and the concept of fatherhood through the narrative. I've learned that this idea is highly intuitive to people native to the Middle East, but endlessly confusing to Western thinkers. That's why of the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity is the one least influenced by Abraham's depiction of fatherhood. And this is the West's primary source for their fatherhood confusion. Jesus, in one of his parables, referred to Abraham as, quote, Father Abraham. But besides a particularly annoying youth group song, Christians do not think of Abraham from the lens of fatherhood. We see him more as an individual historic man of faith. The lack of a symbolic depiction of fatherhood has untethered the concept of fatherhood and masculinity from anything objective and leaves us vulnerable to following the ever-changing depictions of fatherhood and masculinity invented by modern cultural sensibilities. This brings me back to my third premise and back to Bluey. I first heard red flags about Bluey from my two teenage daughters who watched an episode after hearing from so many Christian families who love the show that they immediately saw what was happening. Their first statement was something like, they treat their dad like a plaything. I then watched some 3-minute clips on YouTube from different episodes and saw what they were so alarmed by. Yes, everything I'm writing is from the 3-minute clips, but I checked with some friends who are fans, and they may not agree with my conclusions, but agree with my understanding of the symbolic depiction. So there are hundreds of interesting elements of fatherhood that one can glean from studying how God interacts with the meta-father Abram. But I'm pretty sure Bandit is in no way tethered to this understanding of fatherhood. And this tethering is hard to do. When I'm in the Middle East, I see it everywhere. Oh, I'm sorry. And this tethering is not hard to do. When I'm in the Middle East, I see it everywhere. All the good and toxic depictions of fatherhood I see from those native to this region, I recognize as coming from the Abrahamic stories. It's increasingly hard to see that in the Christian West. For those wanting to go down the rabbit hole of Abrahamic vision of fatherhood, I'm going to give some details in an upcoming podcast. That's the next article in this series. We need to get into the details of the beautiful biblical balancing of the life-giving presence of motherhood and the training, territory expanding, and leadership of fatherhood. But let me say one more thing that concerns me. One reaction I've received is from people who think it's absurd to criticize a cartoon. You might think that Bluey is a wonderful depiction of fatherhood, but please don't be naive about the power of symbolic depictions, especially ones aimed at children. We spend almost a third of our lives experiencing symbolic depictions in our dreams. And most of our entertainment is created by watching stories filled with meta characters and what they symbolize. Symbols tend to bypass our conscious awareness and form our intuitions about the nature of truth and reality. These symbols include things like numbers, colors, animals, objects, shapes, and storylines. The Bible is full of these kinds of symbols, and most Western Christians are totally unaware of their power. When Jesus says things like, how many baskets did we pick up after feeding the 5,000 and 4,000? And they reply 12 and 7. He expected his disciples and us to immediately get the symbolic significance of what he did just from the numbers, but we don't. And in the same way, creating a daughter named Bluey using the color blue is totally lost on us. It goes right past our conscious awareness. If we do think about it, we think it's cool that they're reversing the gender stereotypes of color. We're playing checkers with those who are playing chess, and we've been checkmated over and over again. Looking forward to talking about this more. All right. So I'm done, April. Sorry, it's a long article. What are some things that you sort of stood out to you or you thought about with those ideas?
Well, I think it's interesting the gradual nature that the gradualness that has to happen across a culture in order for this to become where we are. So you referenced in your article, like when you and I were teenagers, the dads that were depicted in cartoons were like Bart Simpson and what's that?
Homer Simpson. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Homer Simpson. I don't really know the names of all of them because I didn't watch them, but it was just a bunch of like bumbling idiot dads and there were like this version of like kind of an adult cartoon that was a new thing back then too, and then even in regular movies it was always, you could start to see the theme emerge of like, oh, the dad was actually wrong and the kid was actually the one that knew the right way that the decision should have been made, and the kid saves the day, and the dad comes to the kid and says, I'm so sorry, I was wrong and you were right and I should have listened to you, and all these things, and which are not in and of themselves like a bad thing. It's good for a dad to apologize to a kid if he's made a wrong decision, but for these to be held up as the example of a father, which is what you get when you're watching a movie. That's all you get to see is that part of it. Yeah. It's very shaping, whether you realize it or not, whether you want it to be or not. It's there. It's what you're kind of consuming. And so I feel like something that I observe a lot these days with young families is the disrespect that children have for adults. The disrespect level of, the way they talk to their parents, or the way a lot of times my kids they'll observe like an interaction between a parent and a child, and they'll look at me like, oh no, they just said that to their parents, or because they know that they would have gotten in trouble for talking to me that way or handling the situation that way. And the parent, it just seems to like not bother them or not faze them. And so I feel like parents have accepted the fact that they, might be some kind of equal with their kids, or that they don't have like the authority over their kid to say the way it's going to be and to stick with it. And so when you watch a cartoon like Bluey, you can see that like the kids are telling the dad what to do, and the kids are playing with him like he a toy, dressing him up, making him freeze when they play the freeze game so they can go do whatever they want to be doing. And and the mom goes off to maybe work or something like that. And so they're left with their play toy. And so, it's a great contrast. Like in a way, it's like, oh, wow, but he's home and he's like down on the floor playing with them and he's present. And I do think that that's, in doses, those are really good things. But I think it also leads to children really disrespecting their father and not holding him in a place of honor. And to have a father who gets down on the floor and rolls around and dresses up and lets you put things in their hair and things like that, it just kind of like, again, it's not like wrong, but it kind of like leads to this confusion for kids, whether or not this is like a play toy person who's here for my entertainment, or is this someone who is, I need to listen to them. They're a voice, they're an authority, and they will stick by what they say.
Yeah. That's a really good sort of challenge, I think, that this kind of depiction creates. And I think that what I'm really interested in is where did that intuition come from? In other words, if you were to go back 50 or 80 or 100 years, everyone's intuition would be to protect the honor of the father. Like it wouldn't be necessarily, that was the intuition. Like if we all honor the father, if we kind of hold, there's a certain level of reverence, particularly for the children. This is actually better for children. Like it's better for the family. It's better for everyone. Like everyone does better. Today, we really see that as sort of selfish. Like the only reason why a father would demand respect like that from his children is because there's something wrong with the father. The father himself wants something that's inappropriate. That's something that would provide something for his ego, right? For his own personal needs. That's kind of the modern intuition. And so that's a huge transition over the last, 50, 80 years to go from, almost, universal intuitions around the father knows best kind of, mentality that you had. And then, and that was depicted, in the 50s and 60s, but it was, clearly existed and was even stronger, I would say, before that. You see that in all kinds of fictional depictions of fatherhood. And then you shift to this depiction of fatherhood, which is the sort of I'm going to be at your level, or the junior knows best kind of storylines that happen. And so I'm constantly trying to understand. And I really think that like a lot of people will be listening to this or watching Bluey and see the kids treating him like that. And their intuitions are all, that's really cool. Like, that's really good. Like, that's a good father.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I want to aspire to be that. And I want my children to watch this show and to think of me in those same terms. That's kind of where I kind of want to like understand what happened there. Do you have any thoughts about how that transition possibly began to take place between this migrating intuition that's gone so far towards, let's bring dad down to our level, and not only let's do that, but let's celebrate that as an ideal?
Well, it makes me wonder, because I think this goes hand in hand with, the simultaneous nature of what our culture is going through with the confusion between masculinity, femininity, all of that stuff. And I feel like, I wonder if there are a lot of dads out there, they're finding themselves fathers now, and they don't actually feel confident in that, maybe.
Yeah.
So they haven't been trained in it. And so they don't really know what to do.
Yeah.
And so I'm just imagining, I'm thinking through like a young dad who maybe never knew his dad, or did know his dad, but he wasn't around very much, or, have the way that things were maybe for his generation, or he was emotionally distant, or maybe didn't believe the same thing. So there was like, a lack of alignment or things like that. And so, not being like, I feel like a lot of times men aren't empowered these days to feel brave and go ahead and step into leadership, because it's becoming such a negative thing, like culturally. And so I'm wondering if they feel, disempowered,
right?
Whether it's just a lack of personal training because of that wasn't passed down to them generationally, or they're just trying to believe something new and different than that their parents didn't teach them. Where do you go to learn these things, or what? So your intuitions are all just kind of off because of that.
Yeah. It's sort of like we're teaching fathers that it's toxic to be kind of a leader because of your gender. And so you then, and to express like visionary leadership on the basis of being a man, like that's a negative thing. That's almost the definition of patriarchy. And that is something that really harms women and children. And so you have to find a mode of being that is the opposite of the patriarchal kind of ideal of the past, which is this leader. And so in order to do that, you need to find these other modes of being, the playful dad, the present dad, not the leader dad, not the trainer dad. And I think one of the things that, as I think about, maybe one of the biggest reasons why I'm concerned about this is it's really not just fatherhood. First, I think family got redefined. So if you imagine that family is essentially an organization designed to be a team to accomplish very difficult things, then the idea of having a kind of a coach leader and respecting that person starts to become intuitive. Like, most people listening to this, if you thought about like a coach of a football team or the owner of a business, right? Then you might say, okay, there is something lost if the football players treat the coach with disrespect constantly. They treat him like a plaything. They don't take super seriously his visionary leadership. And he certainly could be playful at times and fun, but then when the moment he gets serious, it's like, wow, this is really important. And of course, that emotional distance, that's not positive. We want coaches that are emotionally sensitive and thoughtful and present with their players. Those are all important aspects of being a coach. But you certainly, if you're going to win games, the coach needs to also have a very hard side. This movie, Whiplash, basically, a movie about this kind of crazed, drum coach. I don't know if you ever saw that movie, but it's a really intense movie. Basically, it explores sort of an aspect of masculinity, kind of, and coaching to a certain extreme, where this coach, through constantly raising the bar and refusing to lower it, basically makes this drummer like much, much better. And it's a really conflicting film for a lot of people to watch, because on one hand, they see this depiction and think that guy's toxic, he's terrible, he's mean, he's a jerk. Nobody should act like that or live like that. But on the other hand, he created all these results. He raised the bar and he made this boy into, world-class drummer or whatever. So, and I think that's a really good depiction of the contrast. At what point would Bandit be able to really raise the standard on his daughters? It's, you have to preserve leadership and gravitas in the home, just like any coach or any business leader would need to create. And I remember recently we were talking to a teacher who had just resigned from her elementary school because they trained all of the kids to only use the teacher's first name. And then they were trying to retrain the teachers to say to them that any kind of honorific titles or distance that you want to create between yourself and the child, because you're the teacher, you're the authority, you're the subject matter expert, those are all inappropriate intuitions on your part. And they're all really threatening to the children. And so, you hear this and you're like, okay, that is what is happening in our culture. And there's this particular vision around why that is happening and what that's intended to produce. And what I, found challenging in talking to Christian families about Bluey is I didn't feel like there was for most of the people we were talking to, there was any kind of intuition that, oh, this is part of that movement and that's dangerous. That's part of, we've kind of redefined the family. Now we've redefined fatherhood. We've redefined children and childhood. And now we're symbolically celebrating those in a very cohesive and really compelling and interesting artistic expression through the TV show, this cartoon. So I think that's a lot of movement that has happened.
I think that's where I really struggle with this whole Bluey thing. I was shocked when I first heard about Bluey in a Christian context and how everyone was so excited about it. And I was like, wow, I can't believe I haven't heard of this, but our kids are older now. We're not watching those kinds of shows. And then on the heels of it, to hear about what an episode was like from our daughters, and they watched it for like 2 seconds and were like, what is this? So their intuitions were like, this is off. But like we had just been with a bunch of Christians who were excited about it. And so I think I am, that part really confuses me. Like, as believers, why are we so okay with this? We have scripture to help us. Like when you describe the drum coach, so he's got rough edges, rough sides to him. Maybe he's to this or to that, but he gets results. So I think like as believers, we have, through Christ and his power and the ways that he teaches us to live, we have ways to kind of combat those rough edges. So if we're like, in the position of leadership and we're trying to call somebody into something, we don't have to be a jerk about it.
Right.
We can, through the power of Christ and all of the goodness of his ways, we can overcome our own sin, or we can grow ourselves and learn how to deliver the message better, or, deal with that child in a more, soft way, or like there's so much room for growth and change in our own hearts. That doesn't have to be like the jerk leader.
Right.
And so I'm just not sure why or how in the Christian culture this has been so surprising. Now, I grew up in the Midwest, and I feel like, and Jeremy grew up on the West Coast. And so in some ways we're like a generation apart, because what my intuitions are and the way I kind of grew up in the family around me and the world around me, was these intuitions were, like the intuitions they had like 80 and 100 years ago. That's the intuitions I grew up with. You would never speak to your dad that way. And it wasn't because I was afraid of my dad and he was scary and he was mean, he was going to do something mean to me. It was just like, I had been taught respect for your elders, and to kind of get to this place where, also whatever they're doing to the daughters, I don't understand that either. Like, to find out that Bluey is a girl, I was like, okay, what's up with that?
People that
I don't understand
know
why
about the show or seen clips or whatever, they always seem very surprised, that almost as if that Bluey was originally intended to be a boy and then they decided to call him a girl. I mean, I'd love to hear the thought process behind what happened
Like the
there.
writers.
Yeah. Like, was that always the intention?
Right.
Maybe they said, we want a daughter. What color should we, let's color her blue. Let's call her Bluey. Let's call the whole show Bluey.
Right.
I mean, that's a very surprising, symbolic thing to do. Good.
Now in Blue's Clues, now this was back in our kids' era. So, 15, 20 years ago when our kids were watching Blue's Clues, that was the same. Blue was a girl. And I remember I didn't find out about it. We had been watching Blue's Clues, like we had the VHS. So they watched like the same episode over and over again. So I didn't see a lot of the episodes as they like evolved. And then a couple years in, watched an episode where he called Blue a girl or she or whatever. And I was like, what is going on? So that was very, very bizarre, 20 years ago. And so now it's like they're doing it again. It's a dog, it's blue, and it's a girl.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Similar.
What's going on there?
So just the masculinity question, femininity question. So we have a story about when our son was in preschool. We just did it we ended up only doing it for a few months because of this, but he was probably 3. So this is, again, 20 years ago. And it was one of those preschools that was like, come 2 mornings a week from 10 to 12. And, it's more like they're learning a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but they're having fun too. Well, one day I got a phone call from his teacher and she's like, I needed to talk to you about your son. And I was like, oh no, what's he doing? And kind of oh no, kind of a feeling came over me. And she said, well, he has been using the spatula that's in the kitchen play set, and he's been using it as a sword. Well, she didn't say using it. He's been pretending that it's a sword. And I said, oh, okay, waiting for her to say, I'm like, is he hitting people with it? Did he hurt someone? Does he knock stuff over? Like, what's he doing with this pretend sword? And she said, oh, no, he hasn't hit anyone or he hasn't done anything destructive. He's pretending that a spatula is a sword. And I said, okay, is that bad? Is this wrong? Is he breaking a rule? Like, what's happening here? And she just couldn't explain. She just said, no, it's just. And so I said to her, how many girls are in this class? And there were 8 girls, and our son was one of 2 boys. And then I asked her even more questions, and she only has 2 daughters, no sons. And she's like a Girl Scout leader. So she's around little girls all the time. So this boyish behavior was so shocking to her. And she didn't even know what to do with it. It was like we were teaching him something wrong at home, that he would pretend like a spatula was a sword.
Right.
And
it's
so
all socially constructed. It's assuming that's.
Oh my word. Yeah. So we went and withdrew him from the preschool because I was like, he already has 2 sisters at home. Like, we don't need this. Like, that's fine. So we kind of took him out of that because I was like, you're not going to do this to our son. He's a boy and we're going to let him be a boy. And I feel like that's been an uphill battle, even just in the last 20 years in ways that might be considered acceptable ways. And now I can't even imagine. You
celebrate constant gender confusing symbols, and you try to feed those to 2 and 3-year-olds, and then we're shocked when there's an epidemic of gender confusion when puberty strikes.
Yeah.
I think that this, I've just not heard many people, when we're just talking about this, we'll get into this in sort of future conversations, but we're not talking about the things we're doing within childhood that are making sort of the gender confusion more likely. We just deal with what happens in puberty, and we fight about what should be done with, kids that are struggling with some kind of form of gender confusion. We put them on puberty blockers or whatever. I just am not hearing the conversation about how are we raising 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds that is contributing to this? What kind of environments are we placing our kids in? Are they seeing constant, beautiful, celebrated depictions of their gender and being brought into those places, or are those things being challenged in ways maybe they never have been in history? And I just constantly am seeing and noticing these things, and nobody seems to be interested in connecting those dots or sees a connection between these things. So,
need a blueprint to revise your family to be a multi-generational team on mission? The book Family Revision by Jeremy Pryor is the book that summarizes all the big picture ideas you hear on this podcast, available on Amazon or familyteams.com.
Yeah. So I mean, I want to go back to something you said, April, about in the gospel. And you really, what you were describing is we believe in a restored masculinity, a restored fatherhood, not a redefinition. And I think that, because we do have the ability to see men who are being very masculine, also become, all of the servants and affectionate and overcoming some of the maybe the cultural masculine problems that certain cultures have within masculinity. In the gospel, we have so many ways in which those things can be addressed and can create health in a family without having to make a man into a woman or a woman into a man or a son into a daughter into a son. And so I think that the culture doesn't have that ability oftentimes. And so they also aren't tethered to any objective definition of what those roles are. And so they just get completely out of scope with what those things are designed to be. So I'd love to just kind of close this up. And I wrote kind of a much shorter article as a bit of a PS from conversations I was having. So I'd like to read this, and then April, get your last words, and then we'll be done here. But this was the second article. It says, "How Play and Presence Define the Good Modern Father." I've been exploring the reasons so many dads I know so deeply resonate with the depiction of fatherhood in the kids' show Bluey, and I received a great question from a dad that I want to think through here. Well, what's the difference between the dads pushing strollers in Israel kind of father? I talk a lot about that in my book, and that's really impacted me in Israel. And the Bluey dad constantly playing imaginative games with his daughters. Great question. So he's referring to a moment I describe in my book, Family Revision, when at 23 years old and a single guy, I saw a group of fathers pushing strollers in Jerusalem with lots of little kids in tow, which triggered my exploration into fatherhood that ended with me embracing building a family team. It would seem that encountering a culture of present fathers was what got me excited about fatherhood, which is the same kind of father we see depicted in Bluey, right? Well, no, not really. I can see the confusion though, so let me try and tease these two pictures apart. The difference is that what got me was not seeing a dad playing with his kids, which I had seen and experienced, but a culture of fathers embracing building large family teams, which I had not encountered. When I asked what motivated them to have so many kids, their one-word answer was Abraham. Abraham modeled a passion for creating a large multi-generational family. By the way, this doesn't mean that this doesn't apply to small families. I'm constantly getting messages from parents of small families saying, I'm demeaning small families when I celebrate the vision of the large family. Abraham himself was physically unable to fulfill this vision until his very old age after his wife Sarah died. There's nothing wrong with having a small family, and there are some very good reasons for having a small family. But as you'll see, there is a tension between desiring a small family, that's the key, and the Abrahamic vision of family that is worth exploring. I'm also aware of how vastly superior Bandit is to the absent and abusive father, which was so prominent for kids in my generation. Many are comparing Bandit to that kind of father and wonder where I get off. The biblical bar for fatherhood is quite high, and I want to call him into to the highest calling that I see in Scripture. Let me summarize the difference between Bandit, Bluey's dad, that vision, the playmate dad, and the Abrahamic ideal, the multi-generational visionary father leader that I learned from observing Jewish fathers. This list, of course, is my projection on both Bandit and Abraham. Each point is debatable, but here's how I see it. So please keep in mind that the things that I attribute to Bandit include some element are in moderation, some are more of the role of the mother, some that make Abrahamic vision of fatherhood more difficult. Okay, so number one, Bandit wants to play with his kids. Abraham wants to train his kids. Two, Bandit wants to submit to the vision of his children. Abraham wants to sweep his kids into a greater vision, family vision. Number three, Bandit wants to maximize time with his kids while they are children. Abraham wants to maximize time with his kids when they are adults. Four, Bandit's primary domain of fatherhood is with young children in the home. Abraham expresses fatherhood by multiplying the resources of family through work. Five, Bandit wants to experience being his kid's play toy. Abraham wants his kids to respect, honor, and obey his voice. Six, Bandit wants to spend time in his kid's made-up world. Abraham wants his kids to spend time with him in his adult world. Seven, Bandit wants to maximize present fun. Abraham wants to maximize future impact. Eight, Bandit represents the peak of fatherhood with young children in the home, whereas Abraham sees peak fatherhood as being a grandfather or great-grandfather surrounded by generations of the children. Bandit sees, as number nine, the father ideally as meeting the emotional desires of a small number of kids, whereas Abraham sees fatherhood ideally as leading an ever-growing dynamic team. Let me say as I conclude that I think playing and imagining with your kids is great. Many of you are wondering, why can't you do both? Yes. With many of these, that will work. My objection is not the playmate, play toy dad, is how the playmate, play toy dad is defining the good father. It's a small element of fatherhood, in my opinion, even optional. So I'm not a fan of this archetype growing as an ideal. We need to clarify on this more than ever. So I'm sticking my neck out there, trying to challenge this picture. Remember, this is intended to begin a conversation. And so we look forward to getting your guys' feedback after the podcast. So any last words there from that description?
Yeah. Well, I think what you said about it being an element, like being a playful dad, whatever, is an element of fatherhood. Sure, of course. Absolutely. Holding it up as the archetype is where it gets a little scary. That's one thing. And then I think what you said about, I think the title of your first article was something about a good dad actually being a good mother. Is that kind of what
the
it
new
was?
ideal father is the traditional mother.
Yes. So the idea, we've just demolished, as a culture, have demolished roles in the home. And so it's become very, very confusing what a mother's role is and what a father's role is. And so I think, that's a lot of what we're kind of coming up against here. So that's probably a whole nother podcast about like how, because I find that I constantly struggle with that personally, like expecting you, Jeremy, to be a better mom for the kids.
Yeah.
Like don't react that way, or don't say that thing, or don't ask that question, or don't be that way, because that's like challenging them in a way. And I just want to like, nurture them or coddle them, or maybe not coddle, but like, comfort them, nurture them. So I think that you can see the dad being a little bit more towards the like mothering, nurturing side of things. So I think that that's worth further discussion.
Yeah, I would love to tease that out. Just to throw out there that, it seems that the innate wiring, and this is really from lots and lots of like sociologists who have studied, childhood development, is that mothers tend to be extremely responsive to the immediate emotional and physical needs of her children, whereas fathers tend to be more distant and therefore often push the child to the next level. And so, whereas mothers tend to speak at the level of the child linguistically, fathers tend to speak a couple levels above the child. And so there has even been studies about the number of words that a child hears from a father is the best way of predicting how quickly they will advance linguistically. And because the father is just less empathetic, and so he's constantly pushing his child to the next level in a lot of ways, whereas mothers are very sensitive to where the child's at. And both of those are so important. But I think that what our culture, because it really values gender confusion, it wants to swap roles in order to just smash traditional stereotypes. So we want to see depictions of the nurturing, emotionally present father and the potentially distant and, pushing the child maybe to the next level mother. I mean, so just kind of pay attention to that switch. And why are we designing depictions against the innate wiring of men and women when it's children who are at stake, right? It's children that we're trying to serve and families we're trying to build. Like that, is there something lost in there that we're not fully aware of? So
I have one last thing I want to say is that you also said something about listening to the father's voice. And I feel like one of our most important jobs as parents, but especially the father, is that we are training our kids for their future, and we want them to know the voice of God and to hear it and to know how to obey it. Yeah. Not negotiate, not say, well, Lord, I'll do this thing if you want me to, but I was really hoping to do this thing instead. Could you kind of like, work that out? So this whole idea of like knowing God's voice, hearing his voice, and then acting in obedience to it is a concept that's very important for us to remember as parents, that is what we're doing. And so if our kids didn't even know that we had a voice, if they didn't even know that they should like react to it or respond to it, then it's going to be even harder for them in their own faith as they grow up to realize that there is like a higher being or like an authority structure. There's this figure that I should be, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And there's this like fear, respect thing that our voices are. I think one of the purposes of our voices is to aid in that.
Well said. Yeah. If you look at Bluey's dad, Bandit, and you don't feel that he's depicting how you want your children to treat God, then there's
Yes.
something being lost there, because that's one of the
Yes.
that's one of the things we need to do as fathers is we are preparing our children to understand that they have a heavenly Father and how to treat and understand how to interact with him and who he is. So super helpful.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, April.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.